Howdy, y'all. Welcome back to the Kentuckian. Welcome to this sort of comeback episode as I have been out of it for about 3 weeks. I've been dealing with some sort of illness. It's had me down for a while, trying to keep it from getting worse. When it did get worse, trying to recover from it. It's been kind of crazy the last few weeks, but I'm really excited to be back with you. I'm doing kind of a special comeback episode. This is going to be longer than normal. I'm going to shoot for about 45 minutes to an hour. With the topic that I wanted to do today, this actually works really well and hopefully gets some extra content since my fans have been without it for so long. This is an extremely important episode, though. I'm excited about it. It's something that I have alluded to, that I've talked about before, and that is probably one of the most important topics that I could have. And that's on history and what we get wrong about history. And let me be frank, we get a lot wrong about history. Especially in the United States, and the West in general, but especially we're focusing on the U.S., a massive misunderstanding about history. And let me cut to the chase. It matters. History is something that it's not considered interesting by a lot of people, and I have a whole theory, quote unquote, as to why that is. I believe it is very much intentional. History is not taught in a way that's interesting, whether it's intentional or not. It's not taught in a way that's interesting or valuable to these young people, and so they're never interested in it. They don't understand, why do I have to learn about a bunch of the stuff that has no application to me, when history really does. That's how they're taught about it, unfortunately, and it really destroys a lot of enthusiasm for history. But that's not the main reason that it matters. That is an important factor, but the reason it matters, or the reasons it matters, is that so much of our moral judgment, our value judgments, our general beliefs and views come from history. The very question, bringing it home to the United States, because that applies to everybody, the very question of whether or not America is a viable concept, the concept of America and Republican government and all these different principles and freedom and all this different stuff, the very idea and question of whether that's viable or not. The questions of, did the founding fathers actually do anything good or worthwhile, anything worth defending? Was what they did valuable, or was it all evil and tainted and twisted? If the very idea of freedom and individual responsibility are viable in and of themselves, a lot of the answers to those questions are heavily influenced and informed by history. Remember, virtually everything that the left pushes stems from and is justified through historical ills and wrongs, or at least perceived historical ills and wrongs. This thing was done wrong. This common belief was an evil understanding of human nature. These people hated or oppressed those people, etc. And that's used to justify virtually everything that the left pushes. It kind of makes sense. That's part of what we gain from history. But because of that, and because most of what they base their stuff off is either false or falsely construed, falsely presented, if you will, it matters what we know or what we think we know about history. History is so important, and our understanding of history and how we look at history is so important because it is a large part of what makes us who we are as humans. It's a large part of our identity and our values and all this different stuff that I've already been talking about. History is vital. Many of the problems that we face today, in one way or another, stem from a massive misunderstanding of history, and even how to view and learn and study history. So the question we have then is, how do we actually get a good and accurate grasp of history? How do we become good students of history, if you want to think of it that way? But don't if you don't like the idea of thinking of yourself as a student of anything anymore, especially if you're out of school. But I can understand that. But anyway, we need to understand, how do we look at history? How do we take in the information that history provides us so that it's actually helpful and effectual when it comes to all these important questions, when it comes to dealing with the questions and the points that are raised by the left or by the right? What do we think about ourselves as a people, as a people, right? A nation, not necessarily a government, although that's part of it, but as a people, our personal identity, our thing about family trees and all that stuff. That's all history as well. But how do we actually have a good, accurate grasp of it? Well, there's a small handful of key components, and we'll spend some time on each of them, but there's only a few main points. They're really more general principles that I hope to help you apply a little bit more. And if you do start to apply these, they'll make you a wiser, more balanced, more intelligent person, because some of the reasons we've talked about, but also this is a way of thinking. It's a more balanced, wiser, more level way of looking at things and processing information. And even though we're talking about history, it applies to basically everyday life as well, at least the general thought processes, right? It'll broaden your horizons. It'll broaden the way you think about things, and that'll better enable you to make better decisions, to handle stressful social or relationship or work situations better because you have this broadened perspective. So let's jump into them. The first key component is understanding what you can and cannot do with history, okay? We have to be very careful when we judge history. When we look back at what people did in the past and make judgments about it, make decisions about it. We have to remember that history, by definition, has already happened. We're looking at something that is already past, and there's nothing that can change that. To just judge its value or its merit is a waste of time. It's done. It's already happened. We need to change our focus when we look at history. It's not about, was what those people did 1,000 years ago wrong or right? We may look at that, and that's an important consideration, but we need to look at it from the attitude, from the perspective of focusing on learning from history. Okay, what these people did wrong or right already happened. Was it wrong or right, and what can I learn from it? How can I learn from other people's mistakes or other people's triumphs? What encouragement, what strength can I take from the good that these people did, or the way that they fought back against evil, or whatever the case might be? You got to remember, these were people just like us. They had the same hopes and the same fears and the same desires that we do. And yes, they did see things differently in many ways, but they're still people, and we still hold that common connection with them. We can gain from even the way they handled everyday situations and the way they handled things that to us today might seem fairly insignificant and not worth putting down in a history book. We need to realize that we can learn from it in the way they handled things, but we can also see how their decisions affect us today. We can follow, hey, when this happened in the 60s, how does that affect governmental policy today? Or how does that affect what's commonly accepted in schools as normal behavior, or what's taught in colleges? And we can follow that thread. And we can see, oh, this thing that they are pushing on us, say it's, radical third wave feminism, this is problematic. But the reason we got there was because of second and first wave feminism and the sexual revolution. And, you start bringing all these threads together. And it's like, oh, so this really has been a process to kind of degrade morals. And even though it kind of vaguely sort of seems like that now, that we've gotten to one of the most absolute extremes possible, where womanhood doesn't even have any meaning because anybody can identify as it, whatever. Don't want to get off into that right now. But we can see that and say, well, that's wrong. But how did we get to that point? Oh, I can follow this step and this step back and this step back and this step back. And now it makes sense. And you can see that thread of that process and kind of the reasoning or the behind it. And when you can do that, then it helps you process how to deal with it today. It strengthens you're like, yeah, this is wrong. And this is why, like, they've been pushing this for years, and it's been one thing upon another. Kind of it's an interesting side point where sometimes it almost goes to the slippery slope fallacy. And the fallacy isn't quite the same here, but there is such a thing as a slippery slope. The slippery slope fallacy isn't saying that there's no such thing as a slippery slope, although it can be used to construe that incorrectly, construe some of the concepts of the slippery slope incorrectly. That's kind of what it revolves around. But then we actually do see a slippery slope that's already happened, and we can learn from it. We can learn where to guard and how to guard against it. So those two things are related. And sometimes when people talk about that, when you on a podcast or a video or whatever, and they go back to, well, it started back then, and then it kind of devolves into, well, it didn't have to go this route. It went this route for a different reason. You're just using a slippery slope argument. Well, not really. And because you know history, because you know how to look at history, you can trace that back very reliably. We also need to realize that while history is an amazing thing to learn from, and that judging history just to judge it is not really effective. If we are judging and putting making moral decisions about what happened in the past, it should be in the context of us learning from it, because again, it's already happened. Good or bad, it's done, it's gone. Most of what we study in history was 150 to 4,000 years ago, right? We also need to realize, and I'm going to hit on this harder later, we can't make ourselves any better by putting people that have died 150 to 4,000 years ago down. Putting them down, making fun of them, saying they're horrible people, that doesn't do anything for us. It doesn't do anything good for us anyway. Actually, it's kind of destructive, but we'll get into that later, probably. We can't change history. We can learn from it. We can make moral judgments, but in the wrong context, it's pointless. And we can't be made any better by putting someone down, especially somebody who's already died. That's kind of like low-hanging fruit, right? If you put somebody down to their face, at least they have a chance to defend themselves. These people died years and centuries ago in many cases. Putting them down doesn't mean anything, except it makes us feel better. And again, I don't want to get too far off into that. We're going to hit on that later. But it doesn't really make us any better. It affects our emotions, but it doesn't do anything for us. We aren't somehow superior because we said somebody in the past did something bad. Let's leave it at that. Like I said, we'll come back to that in a little bit. But the next key component, the next main key component is understanding bias. Now, this is a big thing you'll hear if you start to study history from any circle, really. And it's an important consideration. Let me be clear. But the thing about bias is to a certain degree definable. So when people talk about bias today, it's usually when somebody says something that disagrees with what they believe, someone challenges on them on something or whatever, it'll eventually devolve, especially if they're not very well prepared in what they believe and why they believe it, it'll eventually devolve into, well, you're biased. That's the way you see it. But, you can't see it correctly because of your bias. You're not looking at the data right because you're a man or because you're white or whatever, right? I mean, there's 1,000 different things they use nowadays where you're automatically biased because of X situation about your life. And that's really that's not an argument, really. That is problematic in and of itself. You get into logically fallacious territory and that sort of thing. But that bias is more readily and more productively applied when it comes to things like history or statistics or scientific studies, that sort of stuff. And of course, we're talking about history. Bias is real, but we need to understand what bias does. I'll talk about this more in a moment, but bias does not automatically delegitimize a point or a record or anything like that. It's something that has to be guarded against. It's something that has to be controlled and measured, but people do and can deal with it effectively without letting that bias color what they say and letting them portray a false picture, okay? That's one big thing that we need to understand about bias. It's not this ace in the hole that, oh, you have bias, so therefore anything you say is illegitimate forevermore. That's not how it works, okay? Bringing it back to our topic a little more specifically, we need to understand that when it comes to history books, bias is a serious, serious problem. So if you really want to understand history, especially if you haven't really gotten into it or you've always kind of thought about history the way that the pop culture way of looking at history, you're going to want to avoid history books by and large, especially on certain topics, which I'll kind of allude to here in a second, get into a little more detail. So bias is a huge problem with history books. If you really want to understand history, especially as you're learning that thought process and that way of looking at things to be able to really understand and gain from history, the last thing you want to do is read a history book. Ironically, right? But at the same time, think about it. I mentioned at the beginning of this episode the importance of history and the kind of impact that it has on our life and our values and our way of looking at things and our identity and all those different things. History is super important. Whether we realize it or not, history is extremely important. Well, when you consider both the powerful and the turbulent nature of American history, and every country, every culture has a little bit of turbulence and a little bit of power in it, probably almost without exception, but America especially so, bias is especially problematic when you're talking about the study of American history, aka history books, right? What historians write about American history. It's not it's not a bad thing that America has had a turbulent and powerful history, an influential history, and people are very much attached to it, and rightfully so. But that bias has become a real problem, especially in the last few decades. But what you'll find is it's been that way for a long time, maybe for different motivators, different reasons, but it's been that way for a long time. And I'll give you some examples in a moment. We need to realize, and this is something that this is really addressing the bias issue from a different perspective. History books are today I'm getting tongue-tied here, are today all too often written to push some agenda rather than to tell the truth. A lot of times history has been recorded because people have believed it's important that those events are preserved, that the record of those events are preserved. Sometimes there's been some inaccuracies there, sometimes there's been some embellishments, but what we have today, and this has certainly been the case from time to time, I'm sure, but what we have today is a different motivator. And that is, well, a few main motivators might be politics. That's a big one, a huge one, right? I'm going to write a history book, and I'm really not interested in history as much as I am in proving my political point. So I'm going to leave things out. I'm going to add things, maybe make things seem more important than they really were at the time, that sort of stuff, to make my point legitimate. Instead of studying history, looking for truth, looking for a way to grow yourself, you're studying history looking for proof for something you've already decided is right. And I hope you can see where that's problematic. I think you can. Another very common issue, and this is something in the scientific community as well, politics is as well, but this is a big one, is stroking the historian's own ego. Well, I wrote a book about this issue, about this subject, about this maybe sometimes literal thing or object in history. And that can be well-intentioned, or often it can be, I'm the expert on the subject, so you don't need to question me about it. Look at me, I wrote a book. It got sold in some museum somewhere. Look at me. It got referenced in some historical magazine. Look at me, I'm a big, important historian. You should respect me. And that's a big problem. Again, that happens in other areas too, but we're talking about history. Sometimes it's to make a name for themselves. And of course, if you're a historian and you want to be a well-known historian because you do good work, obviously you're going to want to make a name for yourself. But in today's culture, what that means most of the time is it's a very self-centered, I just want to be famous. I want to get on the TV shows. I want to get on the podcast. I want to get on the governmental agencies where they need a historian for reference. And, I'm making this not because I want to tell the truth, but because I want to make a name for myself. And there's different ways that can be problematic, but think about this. What's a big way to make a name for yourself in anything? You do something really unique and unusual, right? You do something fantastic, something exceptional, something that stands out among the crowd, gives you that 15 minutes of fame that can turn into more. Well, when you're talking about writing a history book, how do you do that? Well, the best way to do that is to discover some history that nobody's ever known about before, to discover some evidence that no one's ever heard of before, or to give some new and exciting take on a subject that commonly has a pretty common understanding, and say, well, that's all wrong, and this is why. I've completely rediscovered this subject. Well, it's a good way to get attention, sure. And people make some kind of massive archaeological discovery. That might be a thing, right? They get famous because they discovered some huge historical monument or landmark or civilization or stone with writing on it, so we can translate some language we've had trouble translating, whatever, right? But if you can't do that, well, why not just make something up? Why not just, again, manipulate data and statistics, grab from bad sources that help your side, but you're hoping they don't look into them, leave certain things out, add certain things in a way that they, again, hold more significance, or make them look like they were far more influential than they were at the time, whatever factor or subject or person or political view or whatever that might be. See where that comes from? You basically start writing historical fiction based off of it's based off of a lot of data, but you're manipulating it to tell a narrative that you want, so that it's that new, exciting, undiscovered take and all that, and you make a name for yourself. It's a good way to do it. It's not an ethical way to do it. It's not a right way to do it. It's not a truthful way to do it, but it's an effective way to do it, especially in today's culture where so much of what we do, if it's brazen and it gets people's attention, it will make you money. It will get you fame, whether or not it's merited. And that's a big problem. And historians are people too. Scientists, same thing. Again, we're not talking about that, but that same thought process can very easily and does happen. So people like to take the easy way out instead of doing hard research and really, trying to find the truth. I'm just going to basically make something up and put a few miscited sources in there to make it seem legitimate. And that's a lot easier than the other way. And if you get away with it, you get away with it, right? You make the money, you get the fame. So that's a big problem with history books, especially today as well. So history books are a huge problem. How do we deal with bias when it comes to history books or writing in general, historical writing in general? Well, a big thing, and this is something that I've spent a lot of time on, logical thinking. I have a whole series on going through the logical fallacies. And as I mentioned then, if you study these logical fallacies and you think about them and you look at the examples and you really just hear them and you try and process them a little bit, and then you kind of keep an eye out for them and you start seeing them, then it becomes a lot easier to spot those logical fallacies. Well, that applies very directly to history, because when people do make stuff up, when they do make jumps about or conclusions that are logical jumps, illogical jumps, I guess, about the data that you're looking at, about the stories that they're telling, you will be able to pick up on the logical fallacies there, because there are logical fallacies. They're having to make jumps and leaps that cannot logically be made to make their point, because why? At the end of the day, what they're saying is false. And to make a lie work, you have to make some jumps, especially when you're supposedly basing it off data. Another thing is look for the tone and the way that they write. So if you're reading something that they're writing, an article, a book, whatever, a documentary, maybe you're watching a documentary, and it goes away from the data and what happened, and they very quickly start going to, and this person was bad because of that, and this was a horrible thing because of this other event that happened, and we understand that that's wrong, and this is why, and they start going much more into like the moral kind of judgments about the situation instead of sticking to the facts. And then maybe drawing some conclusions once you've set up enough data for it. If they spend a lot of their time making those judgments, drawing conclusions at all a lot of times, if they are oftentimes like, this is what happened in this battle, and this person and this general and this soldier participated, and this guy was shot here, and then they start drawing conclusions onto, and so this means that this general was a bad general because he made this decision, and this soldier was a good soldier because he did this and died this way, and this officer was a good officer that was under bad command, and that's why he was killed. And they start writing those narratives very quickly or very frequently. You need to be very careful. They're probably extremely biased. Because again, they're not focused on the facts. They're not focused on the truth. They're focused on telling a narrative with what facts they want. And that is a good sign. Again, if it's done frequently, it's not bad that ever happens. But you will find writings where that's a lot of what they write about. They might tell us, some of the facts, and then they spend as long drawing conclusions from it or those sorts of things. Be wary about that. That's probably a bad sign. Almost always, if not always. Multiple sources. Making sure you're using multiple sources, and if possible, sources from different sides of the contest. So in the case of a war, if you can get some sources from both sides, that can give you a really good perspective on the situation as a whole, because the people on one side are going to be thinking about it a certain way. The people on the other side are going to be thinking about it a different way. And having those different perspectives, one, can help confirm that what's being said is true when those things align, and can really broaden your perspective and the context that you have for the whole subject. Again, if it's war, for the whole war and why that war was fought, or for the whole economical revolution or the whole governmental revolution, you get both sides, or if there's multiple sides, all the different sides if possible, and that will give you a better understanding of the whole situation. which is really important because you don't want to get shoehorned into what one side says all the time. You need to focus, of course, on truth ultimately, but sometimes we get emotionally attached to history. Makes sense. It's about people just like us, sometimes literally our ancestors. But we need to realize that bias can be an issue. And while even if the side that we favor, if you will, is focused on truth, and that's great, we still need to be aware of that bias and keep an eye out for those inconsistencies. Keep an eye out for when someone is obviously stretching the truth, or even whether it's inadvertent or purposeful or not, are ignoring certain things about their situation in an attempt to justify what they do, subconsciously or unconsciously or not. So again, we want to get a broad spectrum view of the situation. Someone can tell us, they want their side to win, right? We want what we believe in to do well, right? And so we're going to focus it on the good. And if we're not careful, that can lead us to misportray things. And that happens in history too, because remember, it's just people like you and me that are writing these things down. And then a big thing is looking at the right sources. And I'm going to leave it at that for a moment. I'm going to come back to that in a second. I want to make because the next point is more specifically on sources, I do want to make a side point, a note, if you will, that I don't want you to, you'll see this attitude sometimes, and I don't want you to get to thinking that because people have bias, that it delegitimizes all history. And there are people that go down that route. Like, well, everyone's biased, no one tells the truth, no one, and they make these broad statements about how everyone acts. One, that's never a good sign, and that's never true. Especially if it's used more seriously. Sometimes it's used figuratively, and we understand what people are getting at. And just because a lot of people lie today, just because I dare say most people will lie when it's convenient in this country today, doesn't mean people have always done that. A very narrow, unhistorical view, with very narrow, kind of stale, problematic perspective, because it doesn't have a broad view of humanity and just the facts, the historical facts, how people tend to act. And so don't think that just because people do have bias that no history is ever reliable. That's just not true. We can find strands of truth even when there's heavy bias at times, but also people do want to tell the truth. Historians, not always, but especially in Western civilization, have focused on truth and accurate historical info. And so that accurate historical info is available. We have to be careful. Sometimes things are incorrect. Sometimes there's just honest mistakes made. Things aren't known at the time that are revealed later that change our perspective on something. Even with something like World War II, which we may think of, if you are familiar with history at all, may think of as a very well documented war, and in many ways it is. Bias is still an issue. There's still things that were unknown then, that were unknown 30 years ago, that are known today. In fact, there's some books, some very well-respected history books that in general are very accurate, but now that we know they have some flaws because for whatever reason, we've discovered some things, maybe lost records, maybe new analysis, who knows? There's lots of reasons why this happens. And it was just an honest mistake. And that happens too. We need to understand that. But we can find truth, and we need to understand that people can and do put their biases aside and just try and tell the truth. Their focus is getting the truth out there, good or bad. Those people are out there. Those people have been out there. And history is not 100% unreliable. It's not 100% reliable because, again, where does history come from and who writes it? People, just like you and me. And guess what? People make mistakes. People are biased sometimes. It's not perfect, but we can get accurate info. And we need to be realistic about that. And like I said, as we develop a way of looking at and thinking about and processing history, when there are mistakes or slight bias, minor problems from bias or even major problems, we'll learn to pick up on that. And we'll be able to get a pretty good understanding of history. And with that, let me remind you that if we ever start thinking that I know it all and I understand everything perfectly, we're probably fixing to mess up, right? We're probably already got something wrong, actually. And we are fixing to mess up. Because if we ever think that we've got it all figured out, anyone can guarantee you that you don't. And it's the same with history, right? Look for those patterns, look for those behaviors, look for those things, and you'll be able to pick up on that. You'll be able to understand and get that broader perspective. And cool thing about the brain, the way and this is like biological. So the brain, we can document the brain doing this, but also just the way the mind works. When you do something, when you process these things, when you practice, if you will, guess what? You get better at it. So you practice this a little bit, and it's important anyway. It's kind of effect on your life anyway. You work on it just a little bit, and it becomes easier and easier. So the next major key component is watching your sources. And that's why I put looking at the right sources when it comes to understanding bias to the side, because this point is on watching your sources, is on being careful about what you use as your facts, if you will, as your data. Be extremely careful. Like I said, there is bias. There are people that lie. There are incorrect things out there. So be extremely careful about what you take in as truth. And here is the key. If you really want to understand history, if you really want to learn about it, if you really want to try and get to the core of the issue, if you want to learn from it, if you want to gain from it, if you want to have an accurate understanding of history, as accurate as possible, go to source documents. Don't go to history books. Don't go to other books like that. Go to source documents. So let me repeat that. If you really want to have a good understanding of history, if you want to learn from history, if you want to have accuracy in your historical thinking and what you know to be true as history, go to source documents. Let me break that down a little bit in case you're not, okay, source documents. What do you mean by source documents? Good question. Things like official reports and records. So you think about, like, for example, if you're thinking about a political issue in U.S. history, well, guess what? Congress has records of everything that's gone on in Congress. And they're not history books. They're literally just records of what was said and what was done. Documentation, effectively. That's a great source. It's literally just saying what was said. Another example, diaries. It's just somebody writing about what they experienced. Say it was a war. Just this, or memoirs kind of fall into a very similar role there. Usually memoirs are written after, diaries are written during, seems to be the main difference I can find in them. It's just a record of what some guy experienced or some gal experienced. Memoirs, at least the ones I've read, and I have read a few, it's like, hey, I'm just wanting to put down to paper what I experienced. And it happens to be with one particular war most of the time. This is just what I dealt with. This is what I experienced. Other kind of reports and records, right? Maybe on a battle or all sorts of stuff like that. Documentation, effectively, is what it is, right? Go to the documentation from the time, not the history reports, not the newspapers. Newspapers actually are a really, really bad source of accurate historical information. And then also you will look at newspapers and stuff, but not because you're going for the facts of what happened, but you're looking at the facts of what happened from a different source, from an official record, from a journal or whatever. And then you're looking at what the newspaper said about it. You're looking at how what the newspaper said about how somebody was treated. And then you look at other records and you see, was that true? That was that one example right before, I guess, the Spanish-American War. America, I haven't studied that period much, but I have studied it some. It really seems like at least the politicians, some of the higher-ups were kind of itching for a war. And in an effort to foster outrage, one of the newspapers, I forget which one it was, had an illustration of because there was a big debacle about, I believe it was some Americans were stopped in Cuba by Spanish authorities and were kind of handled roughly or something like that. But then what the newspapers did, or at least one newspaper did, was they made this illustration where it was a lady, an American lady that was like mostly unclothed, and she was surrounded by all these Spanish authorities, and they were, basically they strip searched her. And of course, especially at the time, that was just atrocious and horrible. And even though it wasn't a picture, it was an illustration, and that's just what they said happened. People kind of ran with it. They kind of believed it. Like, oh, this is horrible. This is horrible. And people got more and more mad at Spain. I believe that was the Spanish-American War. And so it's one of those things where you can look at that newspaper and see, oh, well, there were some people that were pushing a certain agenda, but that's not an accurate source necessarily of what happened to those people when they got, roughly handled by the port authority or whoever it was, wherever they were traveling. So even those source documents do have value, but not as a source document themselves, somewhere to gather viable data from for what happened, what the reality of a situation was. Also, a good thing, and like I said, I've read several memoirs. I have more to read, actually, many more to read. A good thing about the journals and diaries and memoirs, especially, because they're written by a person just sort of saying their experience, saying what they went through, explaining what they were thinking at the time, and even some of how they look at it now at times. Depends on the memoir writer, of course. It really brings home that human side of history. Like, yeah, these were people just like you and me. Yeah, they saw some things differently. They did things differently, sure. But I still have a lot in common with these people. Again, makes sense. They're people just like us, and it really reminds us. I think one thing it really does is it humbles us. It reminds us that, they were in the same boat that I am today. And I don't want to go off into that too much because I've got some more to say about that later. But yeah, they were real people like you and me, and that reminds us of that and gives us a better perspective of just when we understand the people that were in a conflict, that were in a situation that was worth recording in history. It helps us appreciate that history more. I mentioned newspapers. Newspapers can be problematic. History books from the time can be problematic. They may be a bit more reliable, but one thing that tends to happen is, especially at certain points in American history, say the time of Daniel Boone and kind of the Revolution, colonial era, and a little bit after, you can have history books that are meant as histories, but they get, by the writers embellish them and turn them more into like a mythology instead of a direct history. Sometimes they're meant to be good histories, but they only go off of stories about the people. And at the time, when you're talking about famous individuals, those stories tend to get blown out of proportion because they turn into sort of a legend, a myth. Davy Crockett is a great example. Daniel Boone is another example where a lot of the stories told about them were not true, and a lot of times were obviously not true. But then sometimes historians weren't very thorough, and that was just what they focused on. There's certainly value in recording those stories, but selling it as a accurate history, of course, is a problem because it's not. So you have to be careful about history books from the time too. Again, they can be source documents, if you will, and understanding how people viewed them, or understanding, hey, what stories were told about this person at the time. Great source for that. But it might not be a source for historical information about that person's life. Again, you get to birth records, you get to military reports, depending, a lot of these guys fought at one point or another, and other information that was kind of like public documentation. That's really, really good stuff in order to get to the bottom of some of these things. The writings directly of people, say politicians involved, the letters that they wrote, what they said on the floor of Congress in the recorded, say, if you're talking about the war between the states, the secession debates that a lot of the state legislatures had. Look at what they were actually saying. Look at what these people proposed, at what they said, the speeches they made, those sorts of things. One side note about speeches, this is a side note, but do be careful because speeches aren't always accurately recorded. Actually, it seems I've started to pick up on some threads that make me think that if it wasn't like a speech that was officially documented, the reliability of the accuracy of the words that were put down, or unless we have the speech and, we still have the copy of the speech, which sometimes happens as well, that the person wrote or whatever, that accuracy can be very, very dubious at times as well. So speeches, again, be a little careful with those as well. One example from my research, the "Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death" speech from Patrick Henry, it was very famous and had a big impact on the delegates that he was speaking to. From what I can tell, the part that the speech that we have recorded that maybe you learned in high school or in middle school, that you've probably heard at least part of before, those words that we've learned, from what I can tell, actually aren't accurate, but they kind of are. So let me explain. Again, this is a side note, an example to illustrate what I'm talking about. What Patrick Henry said exactly at St. Henry's Church was not recorded at the time. What was recorded was basically either how somebody remembered it. I think it was how somebody remembered it, and then they went back and went to some of the other people that were at that speech, and they said that this might not have been exactly what he said, but this is what he said. Not verbatim, but this is exactly what he got to. This is the way that he said it, the tone and everything, even if not every word was verbatim. So it was kind of like the gist of what he said, as we say it around here. He got to the writer of that speech got to the gist of what Patrick Henry said, but he didn't have every word for word down accurately because it wasn't recorded at the time. Like I said, I don't remember if it was a guy that was at the church during the speech, or if it was a guy that recorded the speech from somebody that related it to him verbally. But like I said, he kind of went around and checked and said, or somebody did, yes, from the people that heard it, this is accurate, even if it's not word for word verbatim. So that happens. Again, you want to look into those things and understand that, okay, well, this is still accurate in communicating what he communicated, but unfortunately, it's not the exact words that he said. That's one example of kind of a special case, especially when it comes to like speeches. I do want to say, when we're looking at sources, that history books can be helpful at times. Now, you should have thrown away, maybe not literally thrown away your history books, but put all your history books to the side for the moment, and you focus on studying historical documents, and then maybe find a few good history books. Now, there's two ways history books can be helpful. One is they can be very helpful for technical details. War is something that's often heavily recorded in history for a lot of obvious reasons, but history books can be very helpful for discovering the technical details of a battle, for looking at the campaigns of a war and the figures, and when you're looking at like troops involved and how many days it took for this unit to move to this position, and you know how much ammunition was used and what strategies were used here and who was in command of what unit and all that kind of stuff. History books can be really good for that. Now, of course, you still want to be a little careful because people do sometimes make stuff up even there. But history books can be very helpful for that sort of information, right? The technical details that it isn't, like, bias doesn't really affect it very much, or rarely affects it. But there are a handful of history books that can be helpful because they are well written and they are a really good, accurate source of information. Now, I have a few of those history books. If you would like, I could perhaps recommend them sometime. But a big thing to look for is when they say something, what are they citing? Are they citing things, and what are they citing? So one example, and I'm not going to show it to you right now, but I can put like a recommendation list together or something. It's called The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Civil War. And politically incorrect guide, it literally, their symbol's a pig because the pig is the acronym. And they have a series of books on different subjects. They have one on the Civil War that I have. And it's very well written, very well put together, and it cites all sorts of sources. And when it cites sources, it's rarely, if ever, citing another history book. It's almost always citing a letter, a memoir, a journal, an official documentation or official congressional record or that sort of thing. It's citing source documents that you can go back to easily and check on your own. And one or two of the history books that they were referencing, either I was familiar with or I, for some reason at the time, had a pretty good feeling that they were accurate. I don't remember why. It's been a long time since I've read the book. I do have it still, but I haven't looked through it for a while, or read it for a while. But even then, they've cited them, so you can go and look at them. And sometimes just from the title, you can guess, yeah, they're probably on the right track. But you do have to be careful about that, of course. And along those lines, you do need to be careful, but sometimes people that you can trust to know what they're doing may be able to point you in the right direction, especially when you're looking at history books, like, hey, is this history book any good? But also when you're trying to find source documents, when you're trying to find important source information, for your study of history, and they can really help you with those things. So find somebody that you trust to know what they're doing when it comes to history. Not just somebody that you trust, right? Somebody that you think that you know will point you in the right direction when it comes to studying history. Maybe that person's me. I love history, and it's, again, super important, and I do talk about it quite frequently on here. So that's something that I would, I'm always making these episodes because I want people to find good sources of history and to understand it better. And the final fundamental component that we need to consider today, and what is probably in many ways the most important point, because everything else is kind of moot if you forget this last component, and that is historical context, and remembering to have historical context. Historical context is also the most commonly missed consideration today. One of the reasons it's so important because it's so lacking in normal historical discourse. So I guess really I should first define what is historical context. Well, what is context? Context is the, I'll use the Bible as an example. When you say, remember the context of a Bible verse, because we don't want to take the Bible out of context, we don't want to misuse the scriptures. Context is all the verses around that verse, basically. That's a very simple definition. But it's all the relevant information to that verse, right? And you got to remember the Bible verses, that was a way for us to kind of keep track of where we are in the Bible. They weren't written with verses, verse numbers. So sometimes, we quote a verse as if it was something on its own, and we forget that it's in the middle of a paragraph. And the verses are just there so we can find where we want to be in the Bible. And we forget that context and the whole chapter and the whole book. And then sometimes some context of what was going on at the time as well. But when you're talking about studying the Bible, the most important thing is the scriptures around it, and the scriptures that are in the same chapter in the same book, and then the scriptures that relate to the same subject, right? That's what gives that verse context, so we can have a full understanding of it. If you take certain scriptures out of context, you can quote the Bible and literally quote something that the devil said that was wrong. But you quoted a scripture, well, that's what the devil was saying. Well, how do we know that's what the devil was saying? Because of the context, right? We know that you go back 2 verses and the devil said to Jesus or whatever, right? If it's the temptation. And so then well, this is what the devil was saying to Jesus. He was tempting Jesus. We need context to understand that. Historical context is basically the same thing, but about historical issues, historical questions, historical events, historical people in history. And one of the reasons this is so important is because we see history through a moral lens, and I've kind of referenced that before, right? We make moral judgments and ethical judgments and values judgments based off of history to a large degree, especially certain questions. And we should see everything through a moral lens, right? Is it right or is it wrong? But when we think about that, we need to remember that even though these are people and there's that common thread of humanity through it all, if we apply our sensibilities, our preferences, our frame of reference, and our worldview, all those different things, to people that shared very little or none of that, then we are going to have serious issues actually understanding what was going on. If we think about it as if we're the ones there at the time with all of our background in this world, in this age, in the present time, and all of our sensibilities and our moral judgments and what we like today that maybe they didn't like, and what we don't like today that maybe they liked, and all that different stuff, we're not going to understand history because we're looking at it as if it was the same time as today. And that's an extremely inaccurate and problematic way to look at history. That's why we need historical context. And this includes other documents, other sources looking at certain issues in history. And I'll touch on that more in a moment. And again, I've said this before, I mentioned this before, we should not pass moral judgment, or most moral judgment, that we do today when it comes to looking at history. We do a lot of moral judging on history, especially people on the left, but people on the right as well. It's very common. It's a common trope. It's a common thread, and it's a problem. And particularly because usually it's used, especially on the left, but not just on the left, it's usually used, it's actually common. Let me say this first before I explain a little more. It is very common on the left. It is very common on the right to do this with certain subjects and certain issues. And that what that is when we use moral judgments on history in order to belittle, to eliminate, to change history, or to make ourselves feel better, to prop ourselves up because we think that we have a moral superiority over these people. And all that is very common. Again, it's very common on the left. It's very common on certain issues for the right, for people more conservative, or however you want to term it, to be that sort of condescending, self-righteous person that judges history so we can make ourselves feel better about certain things. And that's pointless, it's hypocritical of us, and it's destructive. We need to be very careful about that. I'll put it this way to bring it down, to bring it home a little bit more to people today. We have to have a lot of gall to pass judgment on events that have already happened, from people that have already died, but were also, in general, productive, happy, and moral people, and far more happy, productive, and moral than we are. Like, this country is in shambles. We murder children by the thousands. Every kind of degeneracy, sexual or otherwise, is not just allowed, it's promoted, it's pushed as good and healthy. We have basically no moral character among the lots of us. And we have the gall to look back at people that were at least happier than we were, that certainly didn't have as high of a suicide rate as this country does, and say that we're better than them and we're morally superior to them because of one thing or two things or a handful of things, that the way they viewed stuff or some economic institution or whatever, that, take your pick of something that we don't like that they did back then, and say that we're just way better than them. And I mean... And that can be in our history. We do the same thing with people from 3,000 years ago. And we have this kind of superiority complex to people that did harder things than we did. And not always were more moral than we are. I mean, there's been bad moral times in history. But we've got a lot of gall and hypocrisy to look back at history and act superior to anybody when we look at how morally broken this country is. And again, that's not to say that we shouldn't look back and say, well, was this morally right or was this morally wrong? It's to examine our own attitude, to set our own affairs in order before we start looking down our noses at people that, whether we look down our noses at them or not, are already dead, and what they did already happened and it's done and gone. Why don't we focus on ourselves and make ourselves better and maybe prevent those things from happening again, the ones at least that were actually wrong? And that's the problem, right? That's one of the reasons historical context is so important. That's in a lot of ways, part of historical context, understanding our own role in all of this. And it's not to make ourselves feel good or to give ourselves a superiority complex, like we usually use history for today in a lot of cases. Now, hopefully we understand why we want to have the right, why we need to have the right, open, wanting to learn attitude towards history. Again, what I said, not everyone's like that, of course, although we may do it with one or two things at least. And hopefully we understand, well, that's not good. I want to stop that if I do it, or you already don't do it and you're like, yeah, this is a real problem. So that's important. But historical context is still extremely important when it comes to understanding those things. Yes, it helps us weed out the bias and the superiority complexes and the agendas out of history and our study of history and our understanding of history, just like the other things do to a large degree. But it's still important with our history. Understanding that context, say for Americans, right? Understanding that context is important for understanding our own identity and understanding our heritage and discussing problems that need to be discussed with our history and how they may affect us today and all those sorts of things. If you're from Poland, understanding Polish history and the historical context of Polish history, same thing, right? Pick your country. For the West in general, it's the same thing. For the East, it's the same thing. You want to understand, and really history in general, we want to understand historical context, but especially with our more specific direct heritage. For understanding when we're reading memoirs or journals or diaries or even records at times, understanding the difference in phrasing, because in English, the way that they spoke, say back at the colonial times, was far, far different from the way we speak English today. The words they use are different, the sentence structure often, the common phrases, the adages and the idioms are often different, although there are some that carry over. The references, so that might be, references to books, references to events at the time that didn't really, we might know what they are, but they didn't really get carried over. They aren't well known. The humor of the time, the way that jokes are told are different back then than they are now. And you will still be able to understand some of it. You'll still get some of it. Again, we're all humans. We do still have that connection. And humor is something that we can still often pick up on. But we will miss things also if we don't have that historical context. Understanding the common beliefs, the moral and social standards of the time are really important. Say with taxes. The way that they looked at taxes and the role of government and how that connected with morality and Christianity in general, and what was right and wrong. The way they looked at it then was different than the way we look at it now. Now, there's an element of a lot of we just don't look at it today, and we certainly don't have a very truth-based look at it. But regardless, it's different either way, whatever the reason and whatever the extent. Another example, social standards, right? Manners, and when a violation of manners or politeness, what response does that require? Well, that might depend on your social class and what time of history, but understanding that can be really important when we are reading about a debate that gets really heated between two gentlemen of the 1700s, right? Why did that go the direction it went? Well, what he said was really offensive, even though we don't pick up on it at the time. And that would require a duel, right? Or whatever. It's just, just an example. The worldview in general, right? Morals kind of goes into that. You look at perfect example, religious freedom and the separation of church and state. The way we understand that today is not at all the general way we understand that today is not at all the way it was understood back then. Separation of church and state was not separation of religion and state. It was not separation of God and state. It was separation of a particular institution from federal government so that they didn't have a replication of what happened in England. England was theoretically religiously free, but England also had an official church, the Church of England. What in the United States or the colonies at the time was the Episcopalian Church. They're still around today. That's the American branch of the Church of England. Well, the Church of England was the official church of England, and it was supported by taxes most of the time, and there were certain requirements to that church. Taxes was a big one, because it was the official Church of England, and that led to an abuse of power between the religious hierarchy and the government. And that was something that they really wanted to avoid. So the federal government was debarred, was prevented, was kept from having a specific state-sponsored or state religion. That's what separation of church and state is. It doesn't even mean that the idea of the freedom to worship and everything in the Bill of Rights doesn't even mean any religion. That's another thing people don't understand. It means Christianity. And when you look at the historical context, you look at what the founding fathers said about these things, at the letters they wrote, oftentimes particularly addressing these things so people understood them better, it was for Christianity, Christendom, if you want to use that term. Because that's everybody that was in the colonies, and they knew that you needed the Word of God, and so any other religion isn't protected, really. That's not to say that they should be oppressed, but they're not protected. And again, that's a difference in understanding where they knew what it meant then. What we understand now is not what they understood, not what they knew. And that's where historical context is really important. And that goes to worldview to a certain degree. Even things about science and the way you think disease works and those sorts of things, right? That kind of goes to worldview a little bit. And especially if you go to ancient history or really foreign cultures, say Eastern cultures for those of us in the West, understanding that their worldviews are way more important because they're so much more different from ours. Because the West has had a general worldview that's been pretty similar, and you still want to understand it, but it's way different with those. And understanding it can be really important to understanding why certain things happen in their history and so on. Other lesser known events that have a huge or influential impact on the well-known history. One example of this would be the Corwin Amendment. This is something very few people have heard of, but during the time of the war between the states, and of course the super controversial time, I'm not spending much time on that at the moment. I have addressed it a little bit before, and I do plan to more in the future, but A lesser known piece of history that has a huge effect is the Corwin Amendment. Now, what's the Corwin Amendment? I'm going to give you a very brief overview of it. So, at the time, one of the common narratives is that the South seceded over forced servitude. And, the Union just wanted to free the slaves and that sort of stuff. And, well, that's just kind of the accepted narrative in some circles. But then you look at the Corwin Amendment, and it was the original 13th Amendment. So the 13th Amendment that was fully ratified and became law was the amendment that freed the slaves after the end of the war. That was when slaves were actually freed. Another thing that, again, historical context gives a lot of interesting views on, because you look at the Emancipation Proclamation and that it had no legal authority and some other stuff like that. Getting off track. This is I love studying this time of history, so I don't want to get too off track here. But the Corwin Amendment was before the war started, before the South seceded, and it was a amendment proposed by Thomas Corwin of Ohio. He was a representative, if I remember correctly. I don't believe he was a senator. He was a representative, if I remember. And what this amendment, it was a very simple amendment, like one or two sentences, and what it was an amendment that was written to make slavery in the United States forever legal. It was written as such a way that it was unamendable. It was literally written into the amendment that this could not be changed even by an amendment to the Constitution. And it was an absolute, look, we don't want you to leave, here's slavery. That's exactly what it was. Lincoln loved it. He pushed for it. He helped get it pushed through Congress, and he actually sent letters to some of the governors of individual states trying to get them, and these letters are preserved in the Library of Congress. You can find pictures of them, of him trying to encourage the governors to get this amendment ratified so that it'd become law. It kind of died. There were 3 states that ratified it, and then South Carolina seceded, and the rest, as they say, is history. But it's like, wait a second. So the North offered to the South slavery without any questions asked, forced servitude without any questions asked, and they denied it, and they seceded anyway, and the war started. It's just a little thing that isn't well known that completely changes the dynamic of how we understand that time of history. There's other things like that too. That's just one example. There's plenty of, in that particular time of history, there's a lot of other examples, but we're not getting into that right now. Again, just one thing for you to think about with that. These events, and you kind of look into it and you start to wonder, was there a reason that these events, that these facts like the Corwin Amendment or other things are not recorded in history, because they can change the common narrative. And that's something, again, as we learn to think about history more open-mindedly, and trying to just find the truth and not letting our emotional reactions to certain things determine and control us and keep us off in the darkness. We start to ask these questions, right? Another little point is all the little habits and details of life from a different time in history that changes the way that we view things, or the way that they would have viewed things. Like, what are you talking about there? Good example. Think about the way they had to live. You couldn't just go to Walmart and buy a bunch of stuff. You had to grow it yourself. You maybe had to buy it from a specific guy in town who could make it, and going to town wasn't very easy. That was an all-day trip that you had to do. You had to make time for it. You had to make sure you weren't leaving the crops out, right? That stuff sort of changes the way you look at the world, right? If you have to live that way, or the way that you eat. This is a little thing, but the way, say during the 1860s, 1850s, that they ate was actually very different from the way that the way that we eat. They didn't even use a fork. They used spoons and knives, and the way they placed stuff on the table was a lot different, and the way that they used utensils was a lot different. It's a little thing, but that kind of, like, oh wow, that's I couldn't even imagine eating that way, and yet I'm sure they couldn't imagine us eating the way we do today. Most of the kind of the modern way we eat didn't come along till a little bit later from France. Just sort of a side thing that, oh wow, that was a lot different, and I could see, there's some big differences there. Whether they're significant or not, it's certainly different. The way that courting and trying to get a wife was done was a lot different at the time. Even the way and how much you might talk to women if you were a young man of marrying age was a lot different than the way we do it today, or the way we did it 50 years ago. And those sorts of things changed. Like, oh yeah, they looked at women differently, and maybe it wasn't all good, and at least now I understand where they're coming from, right? You might not agree with it. You might not come to the conclusion that it's right, but you also have a much better understanding of them and a much broader perspective on those things. And the last point is we need to understand, and this is still related to historical context, how easy it is. All these things that we've talked about, we need to understand how easy it is to have our perceptions and our emotions manipulated by lies, but moreover, manipulated by exclusions of information, like the Cohen Amendment thing we talked about, and by what's called synecdoche, mainly synecdoche. That's a Greek word based off of a Greek word, and it's basically using a small part or a part to represent the whole. We have the whole issue, but if we focus in on one part of it that we like for our agenda, then we can make it look like that's the way things were, even though it might only be a small sliver of the way things were. That's basically synecdoche. And it's a big problem in history, huge problem in history. And it's really easy to have ourselves manipulated by those sorts of things. And we can be very emotionally manipulated. And this is what I want to, the last thing I want to spend any significant time on, and is this emotional manipulation, this emotional conditioning or brainwashing that is very common when it comes to our study of history. And I'm going to use one example. And I think me wanting to set it up, I think is going to help illustrate my point. And it's about the National Socialist Workers' Party in Germany under Hitler. I want to be careful about using the word Nazi, the abbreviation from the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany, because I don't know how YouTube likes that. They might not like me talking about that. I'm not going to take that risk right now. So those guys from Germany in World War II, the bad guys, right? The thing about it is we have an extreme emotional manipulation towards hating those people. And this is where you already start getting kind of riled up and like, now wait a second, is he going to start defending those people? Is he really a white supremacist? Is he really a racist? Is he a fascist? Because we have an emotional manipulation to think that sort of thing whenever anybody even challenges the commonly held belief or perception about those people. And that applies to a lot of different stuff, this emotional conditioning or brainwashing. And they're like, why would you say that? Why would you even make that point, Ryan? Well, the reason is they were horrible. They killed lots of people. Terrible, awful. But they had a count of about 6 million people, of course, from the Holocaust and everything. Awful, terrible. And they were horrible. But then we look at the Soviets, the Soviet Union in Russia, and the people that they killed of their own people was astronomically higher than the Germans in World War II. Same for the communist Chinese. Today, they have the Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps and are working them to death, if not outright killing them. And the numbers that we have there are comparable with the Holocaust in World War II, and might be higher because those numbers tend to be kind of, deflated. And yet we don't talk about them the same way we talk about the Germans in World War II and the National Socialist Workers' Party. Well, why not? Well, there's a lot of reasons, and some of them we could probably argue about why it might be in some cases and other. But a big thing is it gives everyone a emotional and moral punching bag. Hey, they're the one bad guy. See, I've made this point before. We shouldn't treat the Germans of World War II like monsters. And again, you may be like, well, what's he talking about? This is that emotional conditioning I'm telling you about. Because the Germans in World War II weren't monsters. They were humans that did monstrous things. They were people, just like you and me, that did monstrous things. That did evil, horrible things. Now, what's the difference there? Because if we understand that we, you and me, if we were in their position or we are in a similar position, we could be just as evil as they were. And that's why one of the reasons that the Germans of World War II are such a massive punching bag for everybody. Because it is far too uncomfortable for morally weak, characterless people to think about the fact that they could do and be that evil. And we've been emotionally conditioned to just kind of, well, they're the epitome of evil. And yet there's people, not saying that they aren't, but there's groups in history around the same time that did far, far worse than they did. And we ignore that. Even at the time, we ignored what the Soviets were doing. And we were allies with them, probably because guess what? We wanted an Eastern Front to draw off a huge amount of the German war machine because they were busy fighting the untold hordes of the Russians. And we could focus on our own stuff on the West and beat Germany that way. So we looked over what the Soviets did, even though it was worse than what the Germans did. So, in that case, a marriage of convenience, right? That way we could have that Eastern Front. The Japanese, maybe not quite to the level of numbers that the Germans did, or especially the Soviets or the Chinese, but they were far more brutal in a lot of ways than the Germans or the Soviets were. And we don't ever think about that. Japan still hasn't recognize that they've had war crimes. In fact, if you look at the geopolitical situation in the Pacific, that's actually a really big sticking point for some countries like South Korea and Vietnam, where the Japanese were so brutal. And the fact that they won't acknowledge that they committed war crimes really ticks off a lot of those people. And understandably so, especially when the Germans were forced to. And certainly not saying they shouldn't have been, but why do we give the Japanese of World War II a free pass? Why do we give the Soviets or the Chi-Coms a free pass? And then we have this emotional conditioning where, the Germans of World War II were just a bunch of horrible, degenerate monsters that had no redeeming qualities. Well, guess what? Nobody, except for Jesus Christ, is wholly good, and nobody's wholly evil. Evil, horrible people do good things sometimes. Good people do horrible, evil things sometimes. What determines whether they're good or evil is how they react to those things and what their attitude is. A good person may do something evil and horrible and do their best to fix it and correct it. An evil person may do something good because their conscience is bothered, or because it helps them, or because it makes them feel a little better because they haven't lost every shred of humanity. But they're still evil because they don't change their life. They don't change the way that they do things. That's just the way it is. And again, that's uncomfortable. And you can get mad and you can get upset, or you can get kind of nervous and fidgety in your chair when you think about that. But that's the case. That's the human condition. And again, if in a country like America, where we in general are morally weak and characterless, and we just aren't strong and we're lazy from a moral, ethical side, we don't want to have those uncomfortable thoughts that, yeah, I could do that too. And in fact, if I'm honest with myself, I'm probably more vulnerable to that than a lot of people because I have no real character. I won't do anything hard because I'm not committed to any right or wrong in the world. I'm not committed to anything, especially right or truth. I'm just kind of there, and I don't really have convictions or very strong convictions about a lot of things. I certainly won't die for them or do anything hard for them. And when we're honest with ourselves, we realize, yeah, I'm probably more vulnerable than most people in history to the kind of monstrous things that the Germans in World War II did, or the Soviets, or the Chi-Coms, or the Japanese, or whoever, because of that. So no, let's just make them the world's punching bag, and we'll just constantly beat on them and treat them like inhuman monsters. And at least there's a minimum standard. Well, I'll never be that bad. And now we feel good inside. And we have this moral, fuzzy feeling that isn't based off of anything except we're not as bad as the next guy, which is a pretty weak thing to base any feeling like that off of. But that's a big problem. And we have this emotional conditioning or brainwashing. Conditioning might be the best word around certain subjects, and that's one of them. To even question the commonly held beliefs, to even try and make a point about them, is immediately met with kind of a bristled, you're getting defensive, like what's going on here? And you have to set it up and be like, okay, now I'm not saying that they're good people, but I want to say this make this point about this situation. And you really have to work hard to set it up just so that people don't immediately turn off like, well, he must be a fascist. So, that's not rational or reasonable. It's emotional. It's an emotionally trained, emotionally conditioned response. And there's lots of other things, and we can talk about that in more detail some other time. But you may ask the question, well, how is that different from just misunderstanding history? Like, if we understand history better, and we figure out what the facts are. We get historical context and all that. And you're like, well, Ryan, what's the difference between a misunderstanding or not having enough knowledge and this emotional conditioning you're talking about? And there is a big difference, but it's a good question. It's kind of a difference in attitude, basically, right? Our attitude is, I want to know the truth. And I didn't know that this thing, say the Corwin Amendment, since I've used that example, I didn't know that existed. And that sort of changes the way I think about it. Thank you for knowing that. That changes my understanding of the situation because I have more context and I have more of those facts. That's very different from, oh, you dare say anything different from what I believe about the war between the states? You must be a racist. Or again, the Germany and World War II example. You dare even say anything different than what the pop culture line about the Germans in World War II is? You must be a fascist. It's an emotional response. It's not a rational response. It doesn't matter what facts you put in front of them. The assumption is, because you've crossed that emotionally conditioned line, that you must be a ist, right? A racist, a sexist, whatever ist or phobe you want to think of, right? And it's an emotional response. So it is, I can see the similarities, certainly, and there are similarities, but if your attitude is, I'm embracing that emotional response, it doesn't matter, what's going to be said to you, because you're like a dog on a leash, right? You hear that whistle and your mouth starts watering, right? You hear the bell, your mouth starts watering, right? The Pavlovian conditioning, where you hear that trigger word and all of a sudden, you've made every assumption about that person and about that situation in the world. And it's a serious problem, but not everybody falls into it. I think most people I have in my past, and there may be areas I'm still kind of susceptible to it if I'm not careful. Certainly want to examine myself, where you will have that emotionally conditioned response and not even realize it if you're not careful. And really, I could talk about a lot of details. I could talk about a lot of specifics, but if I don't address people's attitude and the way that they look at these things, these emotionally conditioned responses and biases and all these different things are going to make it where I'm talking to on deaf ears, right? Because if we don't have that right foundation to understanding these things and to be willing to accept them, we're not going to be willing to accept them. And this is sort of, I've got to lay the right foundation to talk about sensitive subjects because we're so emotionally conditioned about many of them. And so hopefully you all see what I'm getting at there. It's super important. This whole topic is super important. I really hope that you've enjoyed this episode. It has been a longer episode. I've actually gone over my goal, I believe. And so that's great. Some extra content for you and a super important subject. If you have any questions or comments, if anything like that, comment in the comment section below. Don't forget our social media, our merch store. We have some great stuff on there. I'll put a little pop up there. I have some new stuff coming soon. I said that a while back and I thought I was going to get to it and I haven't. Of course, like I said, things have been crazy, but I hope to be back on it pretty much on the normal schedule from here on out for basically the rest of the year. But of course, a time and chance happen to us all. We never know what'll happen. I hope that you've gained from this episode. I hope that you'll share it with somebody else. I hope that it's really giving you something to think about. And if you'd like to support the Kentuckian, of course, the social media, following, liking posts, those sorts of things, comments in the YouTube video comments section, liking the video, subscribing and turning your notifications on. Huge things that both help me get the word out there and help make sure that you see new content and new information. There's so much to learn on this subject. I know I've probably thrown a lot of information at you, but give it some time to process. Maybe re-listen to this video a few times and just sort of kind of chew on it, process it. I know it'll be very helpful for you if you're willing to embrace it. It certainly helped me as I've developed that attitude over the course of several years. If you'd like to support the Kentuckian in a more personal way, we also have the Patreon page, which will be linked in the comments or in the description of the video below. And that support is greatly appreciated to my patrons. Thank you all so much. Your support means a lot and it really does make a difference. And if you'd like to support me in that way, please consider supporting. We have all sorts of tiers available and you have a more direct help on the Kentuckian, and then you also get some special perks and a little more connection with me if that's something you're interested in. But you don't have to if you just want to help out the channel. But anyway, I hope that those things will give you some ideas of ways to make a difference. Start looking, what we've talked about today, start looking and looking for these trends, looking for these things in history. Start asking questions. If you want to ask me questions, put them in the comments, on Facebook or wherever. Find some way to ask me. If you know me personally, as some of my listeners do, ask me personally. And start like, hey, what's an example of this? I think this might be an example. Could you help me with this? I'd love to. Great ways to start, just to start thinking that way. And again, like I said earlier in the episode, it's just like anything else. If you practice, it gets easier and easier. I hope that you all have a wonderful week. I hope that this has been a great comeback episode for you. I'm excited for what we have in store. And remember, friends, as long as you and I are doing what's right, we make a real difference in this old world. This has been Ryan Dalton of the Kentuckian, signing off.